Welcome V1 Lane. He's a dear friend and colleague. He is Associate Professor at the Nanyang Technological University. Over the last decade, he has worked on 2 authored books, 2 edited books. His work brings together several kinds of interface between the postcolonial and the contemporary, between the modern and the postmodern, between art, culture, writing, performance, popular culture, and that which, as Begwat reminded us in Singapore, sometimes is not seen as politics, which is the politics of culture.
Thank you, Rajiv. Now, my presentation is entitled We Asians, Visual Art Exhibitions in East Asia, and I think of this as a sort of counterpoint to what Professor Chua has brought up, in the sense that I think that since the 90s, the 2 most visible cultural manifestations of New Asia, or whatever that might be, is both East Asian mass culture from Japan and Korea, as well as, I think, visual art exhibitions in many ways. So the visual art scene in East Asia, and I use this to include Southeast Asia because that's what's happened, with the Asian value sort of discourse that emerged in the 80s, Southeast Asia, some of the other moved from Southern Asia, which is how I was classified at the university I was studying in, and it moved to East Asia, all sorts of problems about Asia there. In any case, the visual art scene in East Asia is sort of one of the most visible sites of cultural interaction in which the idea of contemporary New Asia has been examined and, as it were, curated into being. Given the necessity of major cultural institutions such as museums to facilitate intra-Asian artistic cooperation. Since the 1980s, Japanese museums started to document the historical emergence of modernist and contemporary Asian art. And by the 1990s, numerous biennale-type events in East Asia and Australia had emerged that exhibited significant numbers of Asian artists. So a key curatorial aim was the attempt to imagine a cosmopolitan and multicultural Asia able to transcend national boundaries as part of the means of us understanding the potentialities of the sort of 80s, 90s moment of the new, even as there was awareness at the same time that the region's cultural diversity and the history of political fracture, Japan and China primarily, made this endeavor difficult. So globalized Asia became both the context and the vexed theme in East Asian regionalization. So what happens in this is that this sort of emanation model of world history that Dr. Chia has referred to becomes challenged by visions of a modernized and increasingly urbanized region able to undertake self-representation in the world. Okay, so my primary suggestion is that this exhibition imagination, I suppose you might call it, can be understood to be an articulation of a modern culture that carries with it, of course, the attendant dangers of reification and collusion with sometimes very often suspect claims for New Asia, Asian values, that sort of thing. However, at the same time, these exhibitionary processes, I think, were disaggregated enough to facilitate at least quasi-autonomous forms of inquiry and flows of humanistic and artistic ideas predicated upon a desire to have a comparative understanding of the regional creation of modern artistic culture. So one of the things that I think that did emerge that the Thai art czar, Apinan Pushiananda, has reinforced is that whatever the limitations, these were East Asian international exhibitions conceived, as he says, primarily for viewers in Asia, where, quote, an Asia-centric paradigm replaced Euro-American centricity. Okay, so what this means is that at least there's a partial decentering of a hegemonic cultural history and the fostering of a cultural agenda that more consistently caters to regional and local concerns. Metropolitan multiculturalism does, however, I suppose that's one way of thinking about just sort of the East Asian multiculturalism, as it were, also always faces the challenge of being swallowed by capitalist modernity. I think two sort of exhibitions that I've looked at elsewhere embody the sort of changes that we're talking about. The very first exhibition that's very important, that, as it were, starts the whole thing off, is a show at the inaugural show of the Fukuoka Art Museum at the end of 1979, which was called the Modern Asian, it was a two-part exhibition, Asian Artists Exhibition, Modern Asian Art, India, China, and Japan. That was 1979, and in 1980 they did Festival Contemporary Asian Art Show. So what they did was they tried to actually look at Asia from Asia. And this is quite an important exhibition because it starts it, and the Fukuoka Art Museum starts off, is begun with a focus on Asia, collecting Asian art material. An important moment in that, and I'll try and come back to that afterwards. But this exhibition was still sort of limited by the national categories. So that first Asian art show had Asia Major, you might say, India, China, and Japan. And even though it's trying to facilitate discussion, it couldn't really get past beyond the emergence of art from national culture sort of context. But the important thing also at the same time is that the second part of the show, they did the Festival Contemporary Asian Art Show, which showed a number of artists from all around the region, younger artists, so that itself was again quite a first. A show that, exhibition that occurs in 2002, which shows the sort of distance from the first attempts in 1979 to 2002, was the Japan Foundation's 30th anniversary exhibition, which was co-organized with the Tokyo City Opera Art Gallery, called Under Construction, New Dimensions of Asian Art. And what they did, this was a 3-year commitment of funding in which they had a number of curators from different parts of Asia, Thailand, India, Ranjit Hoskote from India, Patrick Flores from the Philippines, mainland Chinese curator, 2 Japanese curators, and they curated shows in different Asian cities, in India, in Japan, and this was brought into a big show relatively big show in Tokyo itself, at both the Tokyo City Art Gallery and as well as the Akasaka Gallery of the Japan Foundation, where they put the findings, as it were, together to try to see art from below, to see the actual contemporary condition of art. So these are the sort of changes that I think that have occurred in that course of 1980 to 2000 that really marks, I think, a shift in the way art was presented. What then has contributed towards these changes, you might ask? Well, there is general agreement to begin with that Asian art, contemporary art primarily, drew noticeable international interest in the 1990s, judging by its inclusion in the more established international exhibitions and the increasing number of East Asian exhibitions during that decade. There could be several reasons for this. The Western metropolitan openness to contemporary Asia was facilitated by regional economic integration that enabled all these discourses on Asian values and all that sort of thing anyway to begin with. Economics pushes culture in a certain way, or uses culture in this case. Then there was also, I think, a metropolitan openness that emerged from what the Americans would call the culture wars in those days, the emergence of multiculturalism and the postcolonial within university departments. And you might think it's odd, but they actually have had a significant impact in the way these things are thought. Right? So the exhibitions and biennales that have resulted have furnished opportunities to imagine, to attempt a comparative understanding of the regional creation of modern culture, even if this culture is fractured, and the later appearance of contemporary art practices in the region. And also these spaces allowed the sort of regional meeting of artists as well, which didn't really occur in East Asia, didn't really occur before 1980, I think, in a significant way, though there were ASEAN art shows and things like that. Non-live also tried something like that, I believe. Now, the art critic Robina Mercer has argued that these shifts, quote, the shifts brought about by identity politics in the 1980s and the global trends in the 1990s have affected the art world just as all other areas of cultural and social life have been affected. That is to say, this global turn in art programming went hand in hand with the decentering of the West within the West by these cultural and literary critics. But the interesting thing is, of course, is that the market and governments have been relatively quick to understand that this heterogeneity, this diversity, and even resistance can be converted into the new cutting-edge standardization, again, as perhaps Dr. Chia has observed. So even resistance fits into the new global sort of moment, as it were. The recognized defining moment of this change was of this multicultural exhibition was Jean-Hubert Martin's Magiciens de la Terre, Magicians of the Earth, which was held in 1989 at the Centre Georges Pompidou and La Villette in Paris. Of course, there were criticisms of the show, exoticization, that sort of thing. Nevertheless, it was a metropolitan show that used a global or planetary framework in which the West, non-West dualisms and hierarchy were avoided, or at least tried to avoid it. They were hung together so that what Martin says in the catalogue is that he criticizes the arrogance of our culture and presented the works of these magicians not as primitive but as contemporaneous and thus contemporary art, and he displayed non-Western works alongside Western contemporary art. He also was very importantly put certain emerging mainland Chinese artists on show as well. This contrasts against a show from 5 years before, 1984, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, called Primitivism in the 20th Century. Now, this is an important show as well, but this exhibition demonstrated how tribal art and ancient ruins had informed Western modernism, from Cubism to earthworks. And so it ended up reiterating the modernist logic of treating things that actually existed in the same time frame as having a temporal distance from each other. These are the comments of a Japanese curator and intellectual, Tatehata Akira. And so this framework was not useful in a key way for imagining the multicultural. What is missing in these accounts of critics by Mercer of this multicultural post-colonial that arose are the non-Euro metropolitan multiculturalist representations of their own modernist and contemporary art that occurred at the same time. The shifts in the thinking of art, it might be noted, coincided with the East Asian economic integration from the mid-1980s, as we talked about, and increasing talk of the Asian century. Yet, at the same time, as I suggest, I think that these new opportunities were there to be taken, and they were taken. So, among the significant East Asian locales, the Fukuoka Art Museum stands out because it's arguably this show that I talked about that set the pace for 1990s regional self-representation. And this exhibition becomes the Fukuoka Triennial in 1999, when the Fukuoka Art Museum spun off a new museum, the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum, at the same time. Other international exhibitions within the region occurred, for example, the Taipei Biennale in 1992. This became an international exhibition in 1998. The Asia Pacific Triennial in Brisbane in 1993. The Guangzhou Biennale in 1995, and the Shanghai Biennale in 1996, which became an international exhibition in 2000, and the Yokohama Triennial in 2001. The Shanghai Biennale is very important because it certainly marks the moment of China's entry into staging this sort of global city with global art. And the interesting thing also was that they used one of their well-known curators, Ho Han Lu, who at their stage lived outside China, became famous outside China, became famous in staging Asia in a way, through an exhibition called Cities on the Move. So he was invited back, interestingly enough, as one of the two foreign curators with the Japanese Shimizu Toshio. So that's a sort of interesting idea of what constitutes Chineseness and who stages Chineseness. And he moved in this idea of Asian cities into the Shanghai Biennale. I think he called it a kind of theme, Chang's Spirit of Shanghai Modernity, something like that. So he transferred the notion of Asian cities being modern into Shanghai. So they are participating in the economic development of the region. Another very, very important enabling institution was the Japan Foundation Asia Center. The Japan Foundation set up the ASEAN Bunka Center, the ASEAN Cultural Center, in 1990, and this was converted into the Asia Center in 1995. The Asia Center was closed in 2004, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the Asia Center is very, very important in enabling sort of both staging these shows on Asian artists, enabling different art institutions to do combined shows, and in having a whole series of symposia over more than a decade through the 90s until 2008, I think. Count 10 before you say postmodernism or something like that. So in the Akasaka exhibition hall, they showed, for example, Indonesian artist Heri Dono in 2000. They also showed not only ASEAN artists, but they also moved into East Asian artists. Li Bul appeared there, the Korean artist Li Bul, in 2003. And her work is interesting because it combines sort of these science fiction horror motifs that go with Japanese anime, that sort of thing, in a sort of artistic context. And also, very importantly, they staged the region's modern and contemporary art. For example, Narrative Visions in Contemporary ASEAN Art, 1990, Asian Modernism, Diverse Development in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, 1995, which importantly traveled outside Japan to all three countries mentioned in the show's title. And they, as I said, also did cooperation with other museums, and I'll come back to one exhibition in a second, I hope that's time, called Cubism in Asia, done in the 2004-2005. Okay, so the Japan Foundation did the interesting thing of trying to put Japan inside Asia. Of course, it's been said that this is still Japan doing center periphery within Asia. But the interesting thing about the Asia Center is that many of the people inside it were really not what you call political types. You meet them and they're just the theater women and the visual art women, the program organizers are really interested in art. That's what they're interested in. And the Asia Center had this weird relationship with the Japan Foundation anyway. They would go out to these enormous projects that didn't fit into the standard pattern of what Japan Foundation wanted. And it's still not entirely clear why the Asia Center was shut down in 2004. But with the disappearance of the Asia Center, I think we've lost quite a key sort of moment of doing the multilateral staging of East Asian, especially historical art, which I think is quite a big loss. What then do we say about, can we think about the gaining of representation? I think obviously it is an ambiguous and contradictory process. The general level of increased economic activity and the modern urban vision of New Asia offer new challenges to the exhibitionary imagination. Biennale culture is now part of the cultural capital which governments in the region can use to boost their credentials as possessing the necessary metropolitan culture that complements the creation of cosmopolitan world cities in the region. The inaugural Singapore Biennale, for example, was criticized as being part of the window dressing in the Singapore State's developmental goals to forge a competitive and creatively innovative world city. But then again, better to have it than not to have it, because to have it is to enable new opportunities. However, I think it must be pointed out that this type of challenge is no longer avoidable in the realm of global art. Art historian and artist Iftikhar Dadi at Cornell has asked in relationship to this challenge, quote, "Are we really willing to trade the globalized art world for the pre-biennial nationalist era, even if such were possible? The contradictions entailed in a globalized modernity mean that there are possibilities of self-representation and new artistic imaginaries that can contest capitalist logic within the very cultural institutions which newly wealthy states might seek to forge for the sake of looking global." So to end, let me just go through sort of what I think the present situation, questions of the present situation might be. And this can be sort of classed in three areas: contemporary Asian art, historical modern art in Asia, and Southeast Asia within all of this understanding. In terms of contemporary art scene, contemporary Asian art seems to be doing all right, circulating, though what has happened since 1997 after the Asian financial crisis is that pretty much mainland Chinese art obliterated Southeast Asia, and the rest of Northeast Asia for that matter. But there are many good institutions that have emerged. The Asian Art Archive in Hong Kong is archiving documents of art in the region, forming a very important resource for artists and researchers. That's very important. There have been sort of intellectual art projects as well, organized by Chen Guangqing of Professor Chua's co-editor of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, that tries putting cultural activism into thinking of India and China, especially, and presenting Professor Duara has been involved in what is called the West Heavens Project, I believe. And in the United States, the UBS MAP Global Art Initiative at the Guggenheim aims to present traveling exhibitions of Southeast Asian art along South Asian art, Latin American art, North African art, and Middle Eastern art. So there are these possibilities that have emerged. What about historical modern art in Southeast Asia, the emergence of historically modern art at the same time as Western modern art, as opposed to contemporary art? I know these categories are a bit complicated, but I don't think it's time to go into them. I think that suffered somewhat, I'm afraid, because the Asia Center was one of the key enabling institutions. They did a show, for example, in 2005 and 2006 called Cubism in Asia, which tried to look at this comparative emergence of Cubism. And that was organized with the Singapore Art Museum, the National Museums of Modern Art in Tokyo and Korea. That's sort of gone down the drain at the moment. So in terms of Southeast Asia, I think in some ways Southeast Asia also has suffered from this sort of emergence of China and the crashing of the Southeast Asian economies. But at least we do have a few things that are going on, I think, that still count. One is that in Singapore, at least, we have the mention of the Center of Contemporary Art at NTU. We have the National Art Gallery in Singapore. We hope that they will indeed be able to stage Southeast Asia beyond sort of ASEAN sort of niceties. And there are apparently some institutions in China that are interested in Southeast Asia and Southern China as well, but I'm not entirely familiar with those. But Mr. Kwok Ken Chow and probably Charles Murray will start end there. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our speakers for being so civil about the rude interruptions and the time strictures. Now, for a place like Singapore, it wouldn't be surprising if I said, let's now agree to meet and have spontaneous things happen tomorrow at 8. But as the plans of Vice and Lengo, we are out of joint by only 15 minutes. So we are going to have refreshments for the next 15 minutes and reassemble here. You'll remember there's a wonderful Heineken ad they used to show on local television where a bunch of beautiful art enthusiasts are being taken through a gallery. This is the Rembrandt room, this is the Rubens room, and the enormous sense of relief on their faces when they're finally told this is the Heineken room.